care. Doesn't speak very much at the kibbutz. He stands up at this kibbutz meeting. The image is in like the Hadirochel or one of the halls of the kibbutz, and they have a kibbutz meeting. And he stands up. And he says, "I want to state that I'm opposed to Jewish history." And then he says, I would forbid teaching our children Jewish history. Why the devil teach them about our ancestors' shame? I would just say to them, Yeladim, boys, from the day that we were exiled from our land, we've been a people without history. Class dismissed, go and play football. There's a yellow candle project. We light a yellow candle every year with names of people who have passed away, murdered, Poland and Europe and beyond. And it's always like a very like tense moment when you take out the little name tag of the person that you're lighting for. And inevitably, every single time, there's like a 3-year-old child or a 2-year-old child or small kids, and it's both terrifying and like heartbreaking that we should be lighting for these lives that were taken so young. Hi everybody, welcome back to our Really Jewish podcast. It's great to be back. If you're coming for the first time, welcome to our podcast, and if you're coming back for another listen, welcome too. We're delighted to have you here. This is Yair Eldan and Oliver Joseph talking about what is really Jewish, bringing to you big topics that shape the Jewish world, and talking also about our own personal process and personal examination of who we are as Jewish people and how our lives have been affected, particularly over the last couple of years. So join us here each week on Really Jewish. We have had a little bit of an impromptu break. We're back now and we're talking about Yom HaShoah. This past Tuesday in Israel and around the Jewish world, we marked Holocaust Memorial Day. We're talking to you about what Holocaust Memorial Day means today for ourselves and for our community. Yair, welcome back. You are my favourite person this week because we've had a couple of technical glitches, as I guess would be expected, having run a podcast now coming up on, I think this is our 7th week. So we got it done. We had 2 recordings which did not record properly, and now we're back again. So thank you again. How are you, Yair?
I'm good. Thank you.
Nice
How
to
was
have you.
it for you? How was Yom HaShoah for you, Oliver, as a person, a Jewish person living outside of Israel and also religious? When I think about it, Oliver, the Holocaust for a religious person is a very big deal. I mean, to explain the horror from the perspective of a religious person. How was it for you?
Listen, Yom HaShoah is taken seriously, I think, in the majority of Jewish communities around the world. So it's a big deal. Let me just say 2 more words of introduction for Yom HaShoah because it gives a little bit of the context. Yom HaShoah in Israel, instituted in Israel, commemoration of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, is called Yom HaShoah HaGvura, and Yom HaShoah is the Day of Holocaust Memorial. HaGvura is the Day of Memorial also of uprising and of strength. And so there's this kind of like connection here to the ways in which Jewish people resisted during the years of Nazi occupation of Europe. How I relate to it, listen, there's a yellow candle project. We light a yellow candle every year with names of people who have passed away, murdered, Poland and Europe and beyond. And it's always like a very tense moment when you take out the little name tag of the person that you're lighting for. And inevitably, like now we have, thank God, 5 candles in our family for our 5 members of our family to light. And there's every single time there's like a 3-year-old child or a 2-year-old child or small kids, and it's both terrifying and like heartbreaking that we should be lighting for these lives that were taken so young. Listen, I'm doing quite a lot of teaching at the moment, and I'm, as part of this podcast and other stuff, I have like the privilege to do more teaching than I've done in recent years around these days. And I think you're absolutely right. As a religious person, a part of the tension of Days of Memorial, I'll just do that again. Part of the tension of Days of Memorial is the aspect of, if you excuse my French, what the F? Like, how is this possible in an ethical, just world, a world reigned or ruled by God, that 6 million people could be murdered in this way within the last 100 years? And that could be kind of leveled across lots of different segments of Jewish history where terrible things have happened to our community, but it's particularly kind of coarse when you talk about like whole villages, whole families, almost whole countries of Jewish population being wiped out during the Second World War. Yeah, I never see very much distance between us in reality, even though we play this he's very secular and I'm very religious. Truth be told, our practice is different. But tell me a little bit about how you experience it, and also what's Yom HaShoah like in Israel, because it does have a particular quality that perhaps is not certainly not experienced in the UK or London.
Listen, first of all, it's true that in a way we have the same worldview about the world. We're both liberals, we're both humanistic, but I think there is a difference between us, and I always remember the remark of Jean Amery, Hans Meyer, in one of his essays. He said that the intellectual, secular intellectual in Auschwitz had a severe problem in compared to the religious person who had this past and future to rely on and to speak to God. And he had this convic- conviction that there is justice in the world. There is an account that we don't see. Something about it, and it always echoes to me. And I think it's. I mean, the Holocaust, as always, is a good example for how religious is. Is a function for religious people. In my view, as a person, it enables them to live in an uncertain world. While me, as a secular person, I have to accept evil as a thing in the world. So I think there is a difference. To your question, there are a lot of powers of the state in Israel. I mean, that try to form our consciousness and identity. And Yom HaShoah is one of them. Yom HaAtzmaut, the Independence Day, is one of them. Obviously, Memorial Day, one day before Yom HaAtzmaut, just next week. The state is very powerful. We have a siren. Schools are, making a lot of effort in educating, the little kids and the older kids to the essence of what it means, what the Holocaust means to them as Jews living in Israel. I mean, my tendency, as I think about the Shoah all the time, my tendency is actually to make my own space here. And it was so, I found myself in the gym after a month of war that the gym was closed. I found myself exercising in the gym. It was great. And interesting enough, in Yom HaShoah, I didn't think a lot of the Shoah. I think a lot of the Shoah, but this Yom HaShoah was a break in a way. I think it's only in Israel I can allow myself to actually feel that way. Oliver, yeah. How was it for you?
No, I had this like chidush moment, like we say
Yeah.
in Hebrew, like a kind of revelation. And perhaps it's not profound, but there's something about the person who was in forced labor in Auschwitz or in Treblinka or in the Warsaw Ghetto, or even it's a very dark thought. Even somebody who was shot in the forest in Poland. There's something of that experience, however gruesome and awful, like I'm shuddering as I say it, that they didn't have any conception of the totality of the destruction and the evil that was going on. They had the experience of the totality and evil of the individual person who was persecuting them, and the teams of SS and soldiers and bystanders, even people in their towns who perhaps betrayed them, but they didn't have an idea of the totality. The aspect that you're describing as an academic, and me as a rabbi, and many people in our community, is that an aspect of Holocaust education is that you learn about how a very advanced Western country engaged all of its industrial capacity to murder and burn Jews and some other minority populations. That is, being murdered in the forest is awful. But when you're talking about the sechli, the kind of intellectual, rational processing of the aspects, to do that in totality, to try and understand how that can happen in a European country, a kind of, arguably like the peak of, intellectual moment in the advancement of European democracy and society. That's hard to secular religious. That's hard to process.
I I'm thinking about your remark and how Israel actually is in a way neglecting the universal aspect of the Holocaust, of the Shoah, of the destruction of the Jewish people, the universal humanistic aspect of or what comes out of it, understanding that evil can come from human beings in a certain situation, in a certain cultural, historical situation, economic situation. It could come even from the greatest nations. And Israel under war. It's interesting. I feel it in my body. It's bless you. It's going to and emphasizing the very particular the Shoah, meaning the fact that Jews are persecuted every generation, and the Shoah is kind of a climax of this persecution. And the only thing we are left to do as Jews is to stand on our own and to use power to defend ourselves. And obviously, after October 7th, I understand that that's a very important aspect. And in this podcast, I told you, Oliver, that I look at you Jews in England, in France, and with all, and saying, wow, to be in a situation where you are definitely threatened, but you are not in charge of your own security in a way, because obviously you trust the security forces of Britain, but still there is an aspect of your Judaism that is not, and your feeling that is not clear to them because they're not Jews. And I feel that you are in a very special situation, and I feel that the power situation here in Israel is more adequate to my feeling. But still, I feel that Israel took a stand here, took the path of force, and it entered in a way the identity of the citizens, the Jewish citizens here in Israel, which is a shame when you think about it.
What's the aspect that's entered into the psyche of just to boil that down a little bit further? What's the aspect that's entered into the psyche of the Israeli citizen or the Jewish Israeli?
The psychic of והיא שעמדה לאבותינו ולנו, שבכל דור ודור עומדים עלינו לכלותנו. Every generation we are persecuted. This sense of being a total eternal victim, which, in turn, makes you aggressive, makes you feel that you are in a very dangerous world, and all you have to do is practice power over this sense of persecution. And it's such a
So
shame because
yeah, no, we're always skirting on the edge of entering into a conversation which is specifically political, but this is important material, and then we'll return to our stories in just a moment. There is a battle going on in the Middle East, and I'm not a political scientist, and at moments I want to hide the newspaper away, and at moments I'm somebody who reads quite ferociously in the news and listens to actually quite a lot of podcasts on what's going on in the Middle East. There are forces in the Middle East, both in Israel and in the Arab world, which want to push us apart as people. That's part of the psychology of the victimhood, that we will be in eternal war, that there will always be people who hate us. In the broad sense, before October 7th, you could make an argument that Israel was more toward an aspect of its own personal identity, and the Jewish community in general, of progress and pride and aspiration, and being part of community of nations, yada yada yada. And then post October 7th, I think for both, let me speak for the diaspora experience because you are here in Jerusalem right now, but for the diaspora experience, I've said this on this podcast before, that people who are very, very, very intimately connected to the running of UK society, the political world, the medical world, the research world, suddenly feeling somewhat on the outside. And not that's that in loose terms, the extreme end, feeling persecuted, feeling ostracized, feeling like they don't have a place. And that is, part of my experience as a rabbi is just listening to those stories of people feeling like they've been somehow been outed as Jewish, or been forced to state their Jewish identity and connection with Jewish community, let alone with the state of Israel. But ultimately, in the context of this conversation, that's a political move. Those are some of the extremist forces. I particularly lay that door at the foot of Iran on some level, and some of the more extremist forces in Israel that seek that aspect of division. And what we're talking about is the fundamental leg of that part, which is about whether we belong in some kind of inclusive global society / Middle Eastern society, or whether the ultimate aspect is b'chol dor v'dor omdim aleinu. In every generation they stand up against us to offer destruction, or whether there's a possibility of some kind of community of brotherhood among the nations. It's a big topic, but that's an aspect of what Holocaust Memorial might speak to in this year. That's an open intellectual question.
I mean, the debate over the question whether or not it's moral and justified to use Holocaust in a political conversation these days. When I was a child, I remember Yeshaya Leibovich saying about the settlers that they are Judo-Nazis. And I remember that people went crazy and said, why are you desecrating the memory of the Shoah, of people who died there and the survivors themselves, and using it in a very political way. Nowadays, everybody uses the Holocaust around me, the left, the right, and my challenge is to to differentiate and see when is it justified to use it and when is not. And I mean, the answer I gave myself, I'm not sure it's the best answer, but is when you use a show in order to open the mind, in order to reflect, in order to have a critical thinking about it, about reality, I think it's a good thing because the Holocaust is a very important event in humanity's life, in humanity's to all human beings. But when you use Shoah, when you use the Holocaust to close the mind, to be to be aggressive, to be defensive, I think it's a wrong way to use it. And I think it's 10 years now, by the way, to the very famous speech that Yair Golan gave 10 years ago. It's 10 years about the Shoah. And he said he noticed that there are processes that were going on in Germany that he can see that they are occurring in Israel as well. And everybody went crazy on him and said it's wrong to use the Shoah. But when you think about it, in my test, I think he opens the mind. He opens us. He makes us more sensitive. I think that's the Holocaust. I mean, that's what we can do with such a terrible, historic event.
The aspect of Ptichat Lev, like the opening of the heart, the opening of the mind, I think is important here. Listen, it's tremendously complicated because on the streets of London and many European capitals, there have been people waving lots of banners which invoke Holocaust imagery, swastikas, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, genocide, you name it. It feels, from a Jewish perspective, it feels clumsy, and that has provoked a lot of fear in our Jewish communities of what are the politics of the street that are somehow also seeping into our political process here. But I also think in the broad sense, exactly as you describe, a political debate about how we protect the rights of minority communities, the human rights, the rule of law, governance, those kind of things, that then perhaps some of the discussions of what Nazi Germany looked like in 1939, well, in the 1930s and beyond, is important. But it's tremendously complicated terrain. I want to move us along. Maybe we'll return to this afterwards. I want to move us along to two of the stories that we wanted to present today. We're both in the Warsaw Ghetto. So the Warsaw Ghetto was, at its peak, contained more than 400,000 Jewish people. It was used by the Nazis to concentrate Jewish populations from in and around Warsaw from the 1940s, and was ultimately dismantled and destroyed in part in 1943, where 300,000 Jews were deported, mostly to Treblinka, a death camp. The story of the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto is that many people of those 400,000 died of disease and hunger and cold even before the deportations and the liquidation of the ghetto began. The aspect of resistance and resilience was predominantly present in the character of Mordechai Anilevich, who was the leader of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And they fought the SS, highly trained, highly militarized, perhaps the foremost fighting force of the Nazi regime in 1943. And before the ghetto liquidation, they fought. About 750 people fought the SS battalion. We're not talking about the aspect of resistance and resilience today, but there is something of the story that we're talking about which relates to Gvura, resistance, resilience, opposition to the Nazi rule. We're talking about Oneg Shabbat. And by way of your great uncle Yair, Avraham Levine, You're going to tell us a little bit about him in a second. He sat down at the table of Oneg Shabbat. Oneg Shabbat was a group that met on Saturday, hence the name Oneg Shabbat. Oneg Shabbat means the enjoyment of Shabbat. Normally a descriptor of people like singing and having rest and fine food on Shabbat, as is customary around Israel, the Jewish world, every Shabbat. But this was not actually people sitting around and eating. It was a group of social scientists, politicians, historians, academics, anthropologists who took it upon themselves to collect material from the Warsaw Ghetto, documenting Jewish life inside Poland pre-war and the life of the ghetto. As we alluded to before, the people who sat around the Oneg Shabbat table, around I think up to 50 different academics who sat around that table on a weekly basis on Saturday, didn't know what was going to happen to the Warsaw Ghetto ultimately, but they foresaw in a moment of resistance the possibility was to collect the stories of the people who lived in the ghetto. Ira, tell us a little bit about Avraham Levine, his place in Oneg Shabbat, Oneg Shabbos, and your relationship with him as your great uncle.
Thinking about your remark and your image of them sitting on Friday night, just imagine. I mean, that's resistance. That's bravery when you think about it. In a way, it's at least as physical bravery, right? I mean, to to dwell. I mean, to read about the miseries that goes on around you, right? And to have an historical point of view about the events, to understand that it's very important that you actually document everything that goes on around you. It's in the midst of a I mean, also I can see the basic human need here to control, to understand, to actually exercise your humanity against the inhuman conditions that you are. I mean, I understand it, but I mean, Oliver, I think that there is also something very Jewish about it, right? I remember you mentioned the books in Judaism is a lot around memory, a memory of historical events, of mythical events, and there is something Jewish about this critical thinking, and putting on, you know, the basic platform of events, of facts, in order to analyze reality. So my uncle was part of it, and I'm so proud that I have this connection to Avraham Levine, who was an educator who married the sister of my grandmother, Gute Utner. And Avraham and Gute had a daughter, Ora, and they actually came to Israel. And Avraham, before 1939, and Abraham searched for a job here in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv, but didn't find any job as an educator. The conditions in Palestine those days were very harsh, and he went back to Warsaw. And when the Jews forced to get into the ghetto, he was the head teacher. I think the head teacher or a teacher in the girls' school named Yahudia, which was in Hebrew school in Warsaw Ghetto. Just imagine a Hebrew school. And he was fluent in Hebrew, wrote a diary and hid it. And it was found after the Holocaust, published 15 years ago. They actually found 2 pages from this diary. And the researchers in Yad Vashem had to actually, you know, they didn't know where it came from. And then they actually compared the handwriting and understood it's Avraham Levine's. And Ola and her mother, my great aunt, died from illnesses in the ghetto. Avraham documented the Great Deportation, July 1942. He documented it in his diary, and I think it's actually you can find it online, some of it. And then he was sent to Treblinka and died there. So and interesting enough, Oliver, my family didn't talk about Avraham and Gute and Ora. Only when I was older in my 20s, I understood. I have a very close relative who was part of Onek Shabbat, and I started searching about him. And it's interesting that we didn't speak about the Holocaust. Did you speak in your family about the Holocaust when you grew up?
No, it's an interesting story there too. I only grew up with one grandparent, Grandma Kitty. She died when she was 100, but was very, very English. She had fine china in her house. They drink tea out of teacups with a saucer. For me, it was normal growing up, but she was on reflection, very, very English. And I think in some kind of slightly strange symmetry, my sense of my mum's parents, neither of whom I ever met, in the north of England, so 200 miles away from London or whatever, was they also were quite English. They mum's parents, the family would have come in the late 80s. And my dad's family go back 300 years in the UK. But I think the aspect of Shoah was also some kind of shame in a different way to what it was in the State of Israel. That maybe, in the classical description is kind of those poor European Jews who were murdered. Perhaps internally it was very sad, but not something that they necessarily talked about growing up. Truth is, I don't know. In detail, that's my sense of the upbringing, the experience of the European population. But my dad's generation is now an 18-year-old man. On some level, in his 20s, 30s, and 40s, he would have been surrounded by refugees. And to this day, we have every other one of his friends in our community has some kind of Holocaust story, without any doubt. The story that I wanted to share is also from the Warsaw Ghetto. It's of Rev. Karamas Kalman Shapira, who was the Warsaw Ghetto Rebbe. And it's a story written by Simon Huberband. And Simon Huberband was another member of the Oneg Shabbat. Now, what's interesting about the story is that my sense of Oneg Shabbat is that it's 30 to 50 people sitting around the table doing something which is illegal, that was certainly banned by the Germans, and bringing together all sorts of people who might not otherwise have had conversations. And I think, I need to do a little bit more research, but I think the story of Simon Huberband, who was from Oneg Shabbat, who had seemingly a friendship with the Esh Kodesh. His Esh Kodesh is known by the name of one of his foremost works, The Holy Fire, Kalman Shapira. I think the relationship that he had with him partly came about through his reporting to Oneg Shabbat. So there's this amazing story where they go to mikveh. Kalman Shapira is responsible for leading a soup kitchen for up to 1,500 people during the dark days of ghetto life. He probably had up to several hundred people sleeping in his library overnight. As the ghetto got fuller and fuller and fuller, floor space to sleep got more and more limited. He was supporting people to find mikveh, which is part of marital life, that women need to find mikveh each month. In the darkness of the ghetto, an actor was also illegal. Much of Jewish practice was illegal in the ghetto. This is the story about his own personal practice, Kalman Shapira. So him and Simon Huberband, two rabbis from the ghetto, but seemingly from very different communities, go and find mikveh. And the story starts with them groping in the dark, probably 3 or 4 in the morning, and they cross the ghetto, walk inside of alleys, everything in the pitch black. They arrive at this house. They're greeted by a dark figure who's seemingly expecting them. They fall through dark corridors in this house, right the way down into a basement. The description is them jumping over some kind of hurdle in the house to get into this mikveh. They have to undress in the dark, both of them. They both dunk. This is a ritual act that they're doing in preparation for the high holidays of 1940. Men often go to mikveh depending on the community that you come from, but lots of men go to mikveh before Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, including, I also try and go before Yom Kippur each year to mikveh, dunking in the water naked. The water is supposed to purify you. Both Huberband and the Esh Kodesh, Kalman Shapira, dunk, and they come out on the other side, repeat, get dressed, come out the other side, kind of go through this labyrinth house to get out of the mikveh on the other side. And the last part of the article that Huberband writes is that as they came up out of the mikveh and left this building, the sun was just coming up. And they read the sign on the outside of the door. The suggestion is they wouldn't have seen it on the way in because it was pitch black. It says, opening the mikveh or employing it will be punished as sabotage, and will be subject between 10 years in prison and death. And there's just this I've taught this story a couple of times now in the last week. There's something just very haunting about the aspect of spiritual resistance, of camaraderie and connection between two people, and then coming up at the other side and reading this sign, somehow being reawakened to the fact, a normal ritual act, and then as you exit, being reawakened to the fact of the illegality and the persecution of your faith and practice and desire to be a Jew. It's a powerful story.
Listen, when I read these stories about this bravery of keeping Yom Kippur in Auschwitz, having a little seder. There are a few descriptions of people who are actually making an effort, which is
On Passover.
when you can on Passover, and they try to make something of their very extreme situation in a concentration camp. So when I read these stories, I thank God, who doesn't exist, but I thank him as well. I mean, I thank God that I live in Israel, really, because the burden of these stories, the burden and a Jew who lives is enormous when you think about it. I mean, the fact that they, in order to maintain the Jewish identity, obviously it also helped them in a way, I understand, but it's also a statement that we don't allow these Nazis to continue our Jewish identity, and we continue. I mean, the fact that I live in Israel, it allows me a little bit to relax from this burden because I have this, the state, the Jewish state, which give me a protection in a way on my Jewish identity. If I was living outside, I would actually maybe I would become. It's crazy, really, but because it's so brave when you think about it.
So, what's really Jewish about Holocaust Memorial? Why do we do it to ourselves? There's this great story that we both have come across in different places from kibbutz life. It's in Chaim Chazizi's short story called Hadrasha, the sermon, and I'll share it for a second, but because I love it. Doesn't speak very much at the kibbutz. He stands up at this kibbutz meeting. The image is in like the Hadarochel, or one of the halls of the kibbutz, and they have a kibbutz meeting, and he stands up. He says, "I want to state that I'm opposed to Jewish history." And then he says, "I would simply teach our children. I would forbid teaching our children Jewish history. Why the devil teach them about our ancestors' shame? I would just say to them, Yeladim, boys, from the day that we were exiled from our land, we've been a people without history. Class dismissed, go and play football." It's like also kind of haunting in a way, because we have such stories as a Jewish community of exile, of being thrown out of Spain, of many parts of the Middle East, of even before the Second World War, of being thrown out of many parts of Eastern Europe and Russia by the pogroms, by different attacks on Jewish community, and that's not in any kind of historical order. It's hard. I'm teaching very young kids in our house, and one of our kids is asking why we're lighting candles. Like, how do you even begin to say what on earth we're talking about here, and why is that of value? Yeah, what's really Jewish about any of this? Like any of this episode that we've just recorded about talking Shoah?
I can understand. I think Mazaz who wrote that drush. I think his description is also connected to reality. There were a lot of people who actually wanted to do. We're talking about the first years of the state, I think, and the state of Israel. And in order to actually make this huge effort build a new state. They felt probably they need to disconnect from Jewish history, but obviously you can't. I mean, I understand the sentiment, but you can't really disconnect yourself from the history of your people. It affects you from within, even without your willingness, and it's repressing it won't really help, as we know. So if you ask me to memorize the Holocaust is connected in a way to our critical thinking as Jews about this world. So for me, that's the main thing. I mean, to just to see the complexity of humans, the high and the low, the celestial and the earthly. I think that's my the main idea of the memory of the Shoah. How was it with you, Oliver?
No, I think your description sounds good. I think in a religious context, listen, I'd like to go to therapy and not talk about the passing of my mother and my sister. That would be great. but it would be a totally wasted experience because a lot of who I am is shaped by, two key bereavements in my life. I don't want to compare that to the Shoah, but I'll compare that to the Shoah. Like, it would be nice to go to, family therapy as the Jewish people and not to be talking about Shoah, but it wouldn't help us because it's a big kind of component part of the last 100 years and the last 2,000 years of Jewish history. So, but in a religious context, my sense is, again, for better or for worse, the writings of the Esh Kodesh, which is his Sefer, where he wrote during the years of the Warsaw Ghetto specifically, buried in the Warsaw Ghetto, like the material of Oneg Shabbat. We didn't mention that. The material of Oneg Shabbat was ultimately buried in milk cartons underneath the rubble of the Warsaw Ghetto and found afterwards. All but one of the cartons was found and is now stored in a place called Zich, the Jewish Historical Industry in Warsaw, a must visit for people who are tourists in Eastern Europe. But part of the Eish Kodesh and much other Holocaust literature like it is ultimately asking some of the most difficult questions of being a human. How is evil possible? How do we connect that with what it is to lead Jewish life culturally, religiously, and otherwise? And in the tones and in the voice of Eish Kodesh, as he ultimately progresses towards his own murder outside of Warsaw in 1943, is a real questioning, a real profound faith and bravery, but also a real questioning of what it means to be alive. And to be alive seeing tremendous depravity around you, murder, starvation, desperation, people going crazy. Like, you can't, imagine this kind of stuff that the Eish Kodesh, as a leader of the ghetto, would have seen on a daily, if not hourly basis during those times, and still wrote and still preserved, and in the example of the mikveh, still kept up some kind of spiritual life for himself during that time. Try and wrap up this enormous topic. Tell us a couple of words, like in some kind of central place. Where are you, and how does this leave you this year as we say goodbye to a week of Yom HaShoah and head towards Yom HaAtzmaut and Yom HaZikaron, two other powerful days, days of Israeli independence and days of Mora. Where are you with Yom HaShoah?
I think I am, in a way, torn, not as the past before October 7th. I'm more torn between my feeling that the Shoah is part of the persecution of anti-Semitism, of hatred towards Jews because they're Jews, and the universal aspect of the Shoah, meaning that every human being, including Jews themselves, can actually deteriorate morally and do things that they never thought, never imagined that human beings can do to others. So I think this sense of trying to accommodate these two is with me this year.
So my last word is, well, thanks for the conversation. I think where I am left is there are people who has this really significant part of our story. And I definitely grew up as a young person, certainly in my teens and 20s, like quite strongly rejecting Shoah memory in the broad sense. I didn't want to talk about Holocaust. I didn't really want to learn about Holocaust. I think I kind of, in my youth, probably wanted to celebrate Judaism for the good stuff. October 7th definitely changed me, but, I also met my wife in Poland on a Holocaust trip, and definitely see the importance and the value.
Say that again.
I met Natalie in not in Auschwitz, but in Poland. So it's definitely something which shapes me. I think that place of stopping in some kind of awareness that it is part of our story. And the second part is choice. It's about free will. It is our choice to learn these stories and learn in the greatest plane of spiritual and emotional expansion what these stories can mean. And a part of that, exactly as you describe, is about considering our own humanity, considering how to be the best possible communities that we can be where we are. Letovat Am Yisrael, for the good of the nation, somehow using this material and these stories and this memory to move in good and productive directions, as they say, never again, but also just for the aspect of spiritual expansion and growth. Yair, thank you. Thanks to you, our listeners, for listening. This is Really Jewish. We are really grateful for your support as we cruise towards our 10th episode in a couple of weeks' time. We are welcoming Rabbi Tamar Elad Applebaum, who's joining us for our Yom HaAtzmaut, Yom HaZikaron, our Israeli Independence Day and Israeli Memorial Day episode that will launch early next week with a bit of luck, God willing. Thank you to Oy Vavoy for our musical outro and intro. Listen to their single Back to My Roots on streaming platforms. They've got gigs coming up, which we'll try and announce. We've just announced here that we are looking for a content assistant. If you want to help us produce Really Jewish, or if you know somebody who might help us, please send us their details. Give us feedback on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, or where you listen to your podcast, and send this podcast to friends. We're building Really Jewish from the wheels up, and we are grateful for your support, including on Patreon, where you can make a small monthly donation to support this project. Yair, it was great to talk to you. See you next week for more Really
See you
Jewish.
next week.
Yeah.